Hello, and welcome to our programme, in which, in conversation with experts and colleagues and some fabulous archive material, I take a look at the circumstances and the impact of George Harrison's masterpiece, All Things Must Pass. I'm Tris Penner. I've been fortunate enough to have worked in music throughout my career, both for record companies and as a sometime record producer. And I can emphatically say that there's no doubt that the legacy of the Beatles is as vitally important to music in the 21st century as they were to music in their heyday. In 1970, George Harrison released a best-selling triple album, All Things Must Pass, which contains some of the most beautiful, uplifting and spiritual songs ever written and recorded. Drummer Ginger Baker features on the third album, Jam, and here's his daughter Nettie telling us about the impact of her meeting the Beatles in the 60s.
I first became aware of them, obviously, as a small child when She Loves You was number one. And my very early memories of doing the twist to She Loves You, yeah, 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 when it was on the radio. So, you know, they were a big thing in my life just as a layman. And then, obviously, at that time, I think my dad was probably, I would say, at the end of Graham Bond Organisation and beginning of Cream, that he started to hang out with the Beatles. And then I'd said something. My mother had thrown away some dressing up clothes, and I'd said, "Oh, you throw away the things I've always wanted and something more." My dad wrote it into a poem that he showed to George Harrison, who thought it was apparently wonderful. But unfortunately, it never became Hey Jude. So I'm upset about it. And then I met them again as a child. We went to the premiere of A Yellow Submarine. So my dad took me. So obviously I met them there, but I was more excited actually about meeting Simon D. So if you remember D Time. So, and obviously, yes, they were very big then. And then I further became involved with them later on in the 70s.
Hi, I'm Nitin Sawhney and I'm a composer and producer. When I was young, I mean, the Beatles were the band that everyone listened to. I guess they kind of entered into every aspect of my consciousness from different angles because, for example, Panditji Ravi Shankar was a huge influence on me when I was very young, and I later went on to become godfather to his grandson, and you know he was always a figure in my life in terms of his influence with classical Indian music. So at the same time, it was incredible to hear a band like the Beatles, who was so prevalent in mainstream consciousness, embracing what he represented and his tradition and his understanding of music, and particularly his relationship with George Harrison, which was very strong right from the beginning. And in fact, I was fortunate enough to talk to, well, both George Harrison independently and Panditji Ravi Shankar about that relationship. George Harrison, when I met him at an amazing concert years ago at the South Bank, I think it was the Purcell Rooms, where I saw a South Indian classical musician called U. Srinivas playing, and we were both watching that, and I happened to be sitting next to George Harrison.
That's amazing.
And we chatted for a while afterwards, and later on I got to know Olivia well and Darnie, and they've become friends, and then also with Ravi Shankar himself, because I got to know Nishka and went on to produce one of her albums with Norah Jones as well, and through knowing her, I was fortunate enough to meet Panditji, and actually was there by his deathbed in San Diego. I was at the hospital and by his side when he passed away. So it was an amazing journey for me because also having worked with McCartney as well and having had that connection as well, all of these things happened independently. So it's been weird thinking back to how big an influence the Beatles were on my musicality and understanding of songwriting when I was a kid, and then how that evolved into my adulthood as well.
The fact that I'd met so many people, I could meet anybody, you could go in all the film stars' houses and Elvis and everybody, and we met a lot of really good people, but I never met one person who really impressed me. The first person who ever impressed me in my life was Ravi Shankar, and he was the only person who didn't try to impress me.
Why did he impress you?
Because it was by his being. He taught me so much without actually saying a word. It's by example.
George talking to Brian Matthew on the BBC's Rock Around the World show. One of our contributors, Daryl Easlea, thinks there are many reasons why the Beatles have such a wide appeal.
I think that the most interesting thing about their songwriting was that they took this musical tradition. You know, they were singing songs from The Music Man as part of their act, the vaudeville side of things, but also with this strong love of American R&B coming through the Merseyside docks and all of that stuff. Yeah. And I think the fact they brought them together, so one moment you could have them raucous and dirty singing Money, That's What I Want, and then the next moment they are singing, you know, Till There Was You. Yes. And I think that gave them appeal far broader than, say, Gene Vincent had, or even Little Richard, you know, because that was very much, this is this sort of music, and you're either in it or not. Where the Beatles, it was the quality of the writing brought the parents with you. Yes. And that sort of fact that they were cheeky, you wouldn't mind them living next door to you sort of thing, that I think brought that sort of wider appeal.
If not for you, babe, I could.
That was If Not For You, written by George's close friend Bob Dylan. Now, of course, many fine Harrison songs, Taxman, I Need You, Within You, Without You, and the peerless Here Comes the Sun and Something have been recorded by the Beatles. But George had quite a number of superb songs rejected, which must have hurt. Here's some of his friends and colleagues, Paul McCartney, Apple's Neil Aspinall, Peter Asher and Eric Clapton.
He was clearly an innovator. George, to me, was taking certain elements of R&B and rock and rockabilly and creating something unique. George chose to move into a house in Easlea, and Easlea is, maybe 8 miles north of where I was born. We became friends, and I would go and visit them there, and something grew out of the music and the kind of people we were. I think we shared a lot of tastes, too, in other, superficial things, cars or clothes, but and women, obviously. But I think what George might have liked about me was the fact that I was a kind of free agent. And I think, if anything, he may have already been wondering about whether he was in the right place being in a group, because the group politic is a tricky one. There was a lot about what he had going, which I envied, and there was a lot about what I had going that he envied. In the beginning, in the early days, what was good about being George's friend was that it was kind of like basking in the sunshine of this immense creativity.
And it was difficult, an album had average about 12 titles on it, and it was hard to get songs in. That's why All Things Must Pass had so many on it, because it was like being constipated for years and suddenly being able to let loose, and I did All Things Must Pass basic tracks, 17 of them, just one after another, and I suddenly thought I'd better check out and see what I've got here, and I found I had 17 tracks. Then I had to decide which ones to use, and in the end I thought, well, I'll use them all, because a lot of them were a backlog in order to clear the way for what I was writing at that time and for the future.
In any other band, he would have been the genius lead guy, and suddenly he's the number 3 guy in an extremely successful band, and that proved frustrating. But his musical contributions cannot be overrated. He's remarkable. And in a way, as a guitar player, he's a little bit like Ringo is as a drummer. He's thoughtful. He would figure out a part. There's no crazy random show-off solos in the same way there are no Ringo drum solos. Like everything about the Beatles, it actually was perfect. They just didn't quite realize it at the time, that each of them were absolutely the Beatles were the perfect storm of musical ability, personality, appearance, everything.
Fashion, culture, everything was there, wasn't it?
Everything was there, and they were the best there ever has been. But you can still see, when you look inside that, how from the inside it looked like, they're not being fair to me, and all that stuff. And those things happen within bands. They always do.
I think, with George, it wasn't his ambition to be in the Beatles for his whole life. Sometimes it could be quite difficult to get a song on an album. When you think that in Let It Be, they rehearsed All Things Must Pass and a couple of other George's songs that didn't make it onto Let It Be, right? and didn't make it onto Abbey Road, right, but made it onto his first solo album. He was stockpiling stuff, stuff was building up.
We didn't underestimate George. We knew that he was peaking, as we got to those records. He'd not been really interested in the beginning, I don't think. And because John and I did so much of the writing, he could just leave it to us. But I think he realised, that there was something in this, that artistically and financially, it was a good thing to get into. So by that time, we realised that he was really coming up with the goods.
Writer and A&R consultant Daryl Easlea sees some positives in this.
The great thing that the split gave was it gave the world All Things Must Pass, which I would say is arguably the greatest Beatles solo album because of that fact. And he could never repeat it. He could never repeat it because obviously with the first album, you've got 4, 5, 6 years to stockpile material, and it's the very best material that has been rejected by your group. So obviously, no one would turn down something, no one would turn down Here Comes the Sun. But then, things like All Things Must Pass or Isn't It a Pity, these are just great songs. And that sense, that album, you listen to it and you get this sense, this rush of freedom, this sort of excitement that I'm doing it now, I'm doing it now. Wonderwall music was great, it was a soundtrack. Electronic sound was, I've just got a synthesizer, let's make some noises. But here was the statement. And the fact that it was a triple album, no Beatle had done a triple album, even though the third disc was just a jam, Apple Jam, as it was known, which again, the players on it made it interesting to listen to.
Who were the players on there?
Well, you had Gary Brooker, you had various members of Derek and the Dominoes hanging round, you had Klaus Voormann, who seemed to just be living with every Beatle at the time. I think Ringo came in and out. Phil Collins famously played on the album. He had his heavy friends in a way. And, of course, you had Dylan, Dylan's influence on there. I mean, he completely, although Lennon was the original sort of Dylan Powell, it was like Harrison, Dylan's withdrawal from the scene suited Harrison down to the ground because that's exactly what he wanted to do. And they'd spent time together. As recently as the Isle of Wight Festival, the fact that the three Beatles all went into a helicopter and they lived in his house for a weekend playing tennis and things like that, how fabulous. Only McCartney didn't because Linda had just given birth. So, you had that brilliant co-write of I'd Have You Every Time, which just, it's one of the least likely opening songs of an album ever. Because you'd think you'd start it with My Sweet Lord, or you'd start it with Wah Wah, big statement to come in with. And it sort of drifts in on a dream. And every time I hear it, I'm almost sort of wrong-footed. It's just like, God, I love this record. And that set the tone. And there's that classic thing. And I almost think it started that trend of putting the down track as the first song and then kicking in with track 2 as the starter.
Let me in here.
As we have discovered, 1969 was a tough time to be in the Beatles, especially when the film cameras were capturing every moment for the Let It Be movie. But there was an escape for George.
It was just a very, very difficult, stressful time, and to be, even under pressure, being filmed, having a row as well. So that's what happened. I just got up and I thought, well, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm out of here. And so I got my guitar and I just went home and wrote Wah Wah. We worked over and over on the songs in the studio so that everybody got the right routine. And it was sounding really nice. And then in the control room, Phil was in there with the engineer, making it sound like, this noise. The first track
Phil Spector Wall.
Yeah, well, the first track we ever did, it was this song called Wah Wah. And it sounded really nice in the studio, all this nice acoustics and piano and no echo on anything. We did it for hours until he had it right in the control room. Yeah. Then we went in to listen to it, and I listened to it. I just thought, I hate it. It just is so horrible.
Did you say that to him?
Yeah, I said, it's horrible. I hate it. Eric said, oh, I love it. So I said, well, you can have it on your album then. But I grew to like it.
More on producer Phil Spector soon, but first tales of the real George from producer Tony Visconti, who, like most of us, enjoyed the recent film of George's life living in the material world.
I saw the Scorsese film about him, and I learned so much more than I knew, and he was a real clever person, very smart, and very kind of spiritual. I mean, he was the first to want to go to India, and he wanted to learn to play the sitar. I'm sure they made fun of him until people actually loved the sound of that. George opened up a new area that the Beatles never explored. If it wasn't for him, you wouldn't get all that stuff. And even the sitar was used on a lot of the rock tracks as well as a drone. But he was very, very creative, and he was also my neighbor. I used to bump into George a lot. I used to live near Henley-on-Thames. My wife, Mary, would often meet him in the Sainsbury's or something like that. George Harrison would go to Sainsbury's like everyone else. And just as a side story, once she said, Tony's got a new motorbike. I just bought a big BMW. So anyway, he knew more about my bike than I did. And I hear tires coming up rolling on the gravel of my front entrance. And it's George Harrison. And he said, I heard you got a new motorbike. And he kneeled down with me, and he was looking at the parts and all that. And I said, I'm trying to figure out where the chain is. He goes, I don't think there are chains on these bikes. I think it's a drive shaft, So it was really, really cool. We met up quite a few times.
I mean, in any other band, he would have been the leader. With that amount of talent, he would have absolutely shone. But if he's in a band with John and Paul, it's obviously completely brilliant, but tough as well at the same time.
You're absolutely right. Had he not joined the Beatles, he would have made it. He would come up with a band. You're absolutely right. And in the Scorsese film, you can see how happy he was to front a band.
Yes, yeah.
Oh my God!
It's a beautiful film, isn't it? That
the song "Wah Wah" that they do in the film is insane. It's insanely good. And he's as happy as anything singing that, Such strange chords and harmonies and all these extra people in house. He's got about 20 people on the stage singing a George Harrison song. That's really made a big difference in his life.
My name is Daryl Easlea. I'm a writer, music consultant, DJ. He'd made such an accomplished album. Yes. It wasn't just, it's okay, it's him and some friends and it sort of worked out and, it's just got My Sweet Lord and the rest is all right, which I think almost sort of became a pattern for his later albums. There'd be 2 or 3 really great songs. Yeah. But here, you think of Hear Me Lord at the end of the double album before the Jam. And that song his vocal is so soulful. Phil Spector's just thrown everything at it. It's almost like what can we put in here? And now we've made it this big, we're going to make it bigger. Yes. The passion, this sort of plea to write, I'm giving up, everything I've known, and I'm giving myself over to my God is something quite unusual at that time. And when you think about the fact that Harrison had been quietly influencing, we hadn't had Indian music in popular culture. The fact he had taken the Hare Krishna stuff so much to heart, and people believed it. People that their role, the 4 of them, the race of laughing freemen, they could do anything at that point, and people would follow them. People would look at what they were doing.
So what do you think Spector actually added to this album, and what does Spector mean by saying he thinks instruments should be felt and not heard, especially with regard to this album?
They were both at the right time in their careers to work together, because Spector, had moved away from that wall of sound. He'd never quite recovered from the treatment that River Deep, Mountain High got in 66, 67. Those huge ornate records like You've Lost That Loving Feeling, were 5 or 6 years ago, in the same way that Ticket to Ride and I Feel Fine were 5 or 6 years ago. So I think they both sort of found each other at the right time, and they were sort of exploring a new territory of where their music was going next. The difference between something like Imagine and All Things Must Pass is, I'm not sure if I can actually remember a sort of lead instrument at all on All Things Must Pass. It's just an album of music and lyrics. I know most records are, but it's got this thing. I can't remember a virtuoso solo on there. I can't remember, a brilliant drum part. I just remember this thing being created. And I think, that's what he did also with the Let It Be album, which has come in for a lot of criticism, mainly from McCartney over the years, of him ladling on the strings and the thing. But actually, you know, I can't. Every time I hear the version Long and Winding Road without them, I think.
McCartney once said to me that was the version, the Phil Spector one.
Really?
Back in the 80s, yeah.
Right.
He did say that we were using it as a B-side for something, a re-record he had done. I said, what's the definitive? Well, that's the one, isn't it? And it was sort of a wink.
My name's Ken Scott. I was a recording engineer at Abbey Road, then Trident, and then moved into record production.
So tell me what it was like then to get the call from George asking you to work on All Things Must Pass. How did that happen?
As an engineer, you were just put on sessions.
Yeah.
Now, I would obviously like to think that the phone call was put in, we've got to work with Ken, but I don't know if that did happen. But as I'd worked with them in the past, then I was put on the sessions, and we went from there. The first thing, all of the 8-track tapes. He had started it at Abbey Road with an engineer called Phil McDonald.
Yeah.
They'd recorded all the basic tracks on 8-track. But it became obvious that they needed a lot more to go on it. And so by this time, Trident was 16-track. And so George came basically because of that. And we transferred all of the 8 tracks over to the 16 and then continued recording from there and then mixed.
What was it like working with Phil Spector?
I didn't. That was
How
one
weird
of the joys. He was there for the basic tracks.
Yeah.
Then he went back to LA whilst we did the overdubs.
Yeah.
So it was just George and I basically. And then when it came time to mix, Phil had come back to England by then, but he would come in. George and I would start a mix about 2:00 in the afternoon. Around about 7, say, when we'd got it fairly close to what we thought it should be, Phil would come in, we'd play it for him, he'd make some comments, some we'd go along with, some we wouldn't. He'd eventually go, we'd finish the mix. George would go, I'd set up for the next day, we'd come in at 2:00, start the next mix, and it was like that every day. So working with Phil on All Things Must Pass, very little.
Do you actually have a favourite song on All Things Must Pass, Ken? And if so, which one is it?
It depends on any given day.
Because it is an amazing collection of songs, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's when I got to work with George again, shortly before his passing, the ridiculous thing was we sat down in his studio and we're listening to the original master tapes, the ones that we had done however many years before it was, I can't remember. And
well, it was nearly 30 years before, wasn't it?
Okay, if it was 30, okay. So we're sitting there and we're listening and we just look at each other and burst out laughing. And it was for 2 reasons. One, here we are, 30 years on, doing exactly the same as we did 30 years ago. It just didn't make any sense to us. Yeah. The other thing was that how much we hated the sound. It was, we had both moved on. We loved all of the reverb and all of that 30 years ago. Yes. And now we'd like things a lot drier, a lot cleaner. And so hearing it was just, we wanted to remix it again. Do almost like what was the Let It
Naked, they're going to Let It Be Naked, I think they called it.
Yes, that was it.
Yeah.
Something like that. Get rid of all of the Spector side of things. I don't know if that would work.
Do you know what I think? I think that would now feel dated as well, because that bareness was a sound in 2000, and for some reason I've been playing that out. I've been playing All Things Must Pass again recently, and it sounds contemporary. It's a really weird thing to say.
Okay.
You know, it sounds really good, you know, Ken, especially your remastering that you did then.
Okay.
That's it sounds... I talked to someone else about the record and they said, you don't really notice anything apart from the songs and the vocal. And isn't that a brilliant thing to say about isn't that a brilliant thing to say about an album?
That is actually, that's wonderful. No, my whole thing is that get rid of all of that reverb and all of that. You might start to hear some things that managed to be covered up by all of that reverb, and it might not. There might be mistakes and things like that would suddenly become evident. And also these days, without George, I don't think it should be done.
course, George, like Paul, had worked with a number of Apple Records artists such as Badfinger, Jackie Lomax and Billy Preston, who had earlier recorded a stunning version of that title track.
Sunset doesn't last all evening.
That was Billy Preston's version of All Things Must Pass. I'm Tris Penner. We're taking a fresh look at George Harrison's solo album All Things Must Pass. There are just so many great tracks on this set, but Olivia Harrison definitely has a favourite.
I get asked that question a lot, what's my favourite song, but actually run-of-the-mill, I think it is my favourite George song. You know, it's the sentiment and the wisdom in it, and it's a reminder of how to live.
It's been a real pleasure for me exploring and enjoying this incredibly beautiful album with you. And we will leave you with Billy Preston on the best-known track on All Things Must Pass.
We were on tour with Bonnie and Delaney. They came over to England, and George was a big fan. And one place we were, we had a piano in the dressing room. And the discussion was, how do you write a gospel song? So I went to the piano, started playing some gospel changes. And I don't know if it was Delaney or Bonnie, but one of them started saying, oh, my Lord. And then they went on. We said, hallelujah, sweet Lord.
Clips you heard of George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Neil Aspinal and Eric Clapton were all courtesy of the Harrison family. Thank you to all our contributors and producer Mark Simpson.